official Russia is in denial about this. I was on a show with Sky Arabia, which is not exactly opposed to the Moscow line, and we had a Moscow professor pushing the Kremlin line, and he said, there are no North Korean troops in Russia at all. Show me a photograph, Mr. Fox. You don't have photographs of them, do you? They are not there. This is an extremely tender point because Russia could have the troops just about, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it is pretty clear that the 10,000, 11,000 North Koreans estimated to be in there and to be in training and coming forward to the battlefront in Kursk and Kharkiv is just the beginning. The British estimate, and the Brits have been pretty good on this, is that the offer, and there is a big trade going on between Moscow and Pyongyang at the moment, the offer is over 100,000. Now, what does that mean if you're reliant on 100,000 fighters? And as you rightly say, they've been getting always levies from the minorities, the former Soviet satellites, the former Soviet stans, and now either in the Federation or on the edge of the Federation. They're being paid to come in, and they have moved into Yemen to recruit forces. Now, that speaks of something. And the something is this, as I alluded to, is that it is fairly evident that Putin and his inner core in the National Security Council of Russia realize they cannot afford a general mobilization. In the jargon, they have had a crypto general mobilization. And over the past 2.5 years, this has yielded forces of over 1 million. But the requirement is enormous. They went in with about 120, 150,000 in Feb 22. There's at least double that amount. There's about triple that amount in and around the area, actually in the fighting line or prepared to come in. But the requirement still is, and this is the unknown, which I would really like to know more about, over 500,000 is required for internal security. Not just I'm not talking about police here. I'm talking about interior forces, whether from the Interior Ministry or from the Defense Ministry itself. Now, that's a hell of an ask.
And on the broader kind of geopolitics of the situation, is there not a massive risk for Putin, who is clearly hoping that the incoming Trump administration is less hostile to Moscow than the Biden administration has been or the Harris administration would have been? Is there not a risk for him that if he is seen to be getting too close to Iran, who of course have been providing Shahed drones to him, if he's seen to be getting too close to the Houthis in Yemen, to the North Koreans, palling up with China, is there not a massive risk for him that the people in the Trump administration who may be Moscow doves but are very much Iran hawks turn against him?
From what one can see, from the way that the information war was conducted during the election campaign in America, Putin himself, and again, his inner core, is neutral about Trump. He doesn't necessarily regard Trump as an ally, but he regards whatever threat there may be, the major threat, the front foot kind of stuff that one heard from time to time from Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan, that is going to be dialed down. And that is why we can see, haven't we, that the concentration is on Europe. Europe is the enemy as much as anything, and European NATO. He thinks there is one view of the Kremlinologists now, is that they see is that Trump may do enough damage to America himself for Russia really to have to bother making a main effort there. And I think there's something to that. But going to your point about Iran, the Houthis, now Iran gets a bit difficult because one of the things of increasing Russia's power base and anchoring it as the central Eurasian power, which is Putin's vision. It is the great fact of European and Asia, is that he's going to accrete. He wants to absorb countries, very much Ukraine, in the way that he's doing on the one hand Belarus, but the other is Georgia. And in Georgia, there's a lot of activity again. The resurrection of the 2008 conflict, arguments. There has been an election, which Russia obviously had its fingers in, and it didn't go entirely against them. As I said, Abkhazia Ossetia has come up again. And also there is competition for access through the Caspian and Caspian oil via Azerbaijan. Oops. And here they come into competition, possibly even local conflict with Iran. Am I making it sound complicated? I hope I am. It is an extremely complicated mosaic. And that's why we have to see what Russia is trading. And there are two aspects to this that I would like to stress. One is the widening of the war in the grey zones, undeclared war, hot war, but very nasty hostile acts, surveillance, and even possibly cutting of communication cables is the latest. Possibly sabotage bombs, particularly with carriers and in Western warehouses. You've got that. And the other thing is the extraordinary remarks again about North Korea. Because leading up to all this, we had the publication, both in Pyongyang and Moscow, of the Mutual Defense Pact agreed by the two leaders in June. And you have to look very carefully. It is a mirror of NATO. They agree to mutual defense, that if one is attacked and invaded, and this is spelt out explicitly in the treaty, the other will come to its rescue. Now, let's move on a bit. I hope it's only a few days. We see the use of the Oreshnik missile, which seems to be a bit of escalation on the battlefield. Yes, it is a very effective weapon, and it's an intermediate, potentially nuclear weapon, which would have been banned in the INF Treaty, which was abandoned by Trump in 2019. What is important about the attack of the Oreshnik missile on Dnipro is that it showed its capability. It had an IMRV capability, a multi-reentrant warhead, 64 warheads on it. They were conventional. So it's a beast that can do quite a bit. The most important thing was the accompanying text, because within 36 hours, Putin goes on television to explain what this is about. This is a real challenge to air defenses. No Western air defense can defeat this. And he's doing it because it's aimed at the US and Britain for allowing ATACMS, deep strike weapons on the battlefield around Kursk, and Storm Shadow. It's interesting he didn't raise Scalp, because certainly the French Storm Shadow will also be released. And what he accused the West of, and this is where the text is ominous, he says, this is the response to the West plans to, US plans to produce and deploy intermediate and short-range missiles in Europe, yes, the shields and so on, and the Asia-Pacific region. And this is why there is such alarm in South Korea as to what is going on. Because with one bound, as it were, the frozen war in the Korean War of 1953 has become semi-Freddo. It's not quite a hot war yet, but it's like a semi-Freddo ice cream. You know, it's melting. It's getting there. And South Koreans, with some justification, are fearing Kim Jong-un, breaking out of his isolation and having a go. That is a really serious point. And also, earlier on in the speech, Putin made it absolutely clear that he was going on with the war in Ukraine because, after all, it was provoked with the West. Now, the bit that we really have to focus on is why this has become like a perpetuum mobile machine. Putin needs the war machine because when the war machine stops, the economy, which is overheated anyway, will probably fall apart or have to adjust and adapt in an extraordinary way. And that is when his position becomes very delicate.
We're heading into a politically uncertain time. The Russians are burning through a tremendous amount of equipment that they cannot afford to keep losing at current rates. And all estimates indicate that the Russians, between the next 12 to 18 months, they will start to tap out with their gas tank. And a lot remains in flux, and we'll see whether or not the West decides to set conditions to exploit the Russians having vulnerability, or if we're going to concede early and go into some, what I would argue, are premature negotiations and cede premature concessions. So yeah, it's a very interesting time. Lots to unpack.
Well, let's drill down into some of the detail. I mean, first of all, you mentioned the issue that Russia have with supplies. I mean, there has been so much focus on, Russia's manpower problem and the very high casualty rates in the east of Ukraine. Why do you think there has been less focus on the supply issues Russia is facing, particularly given we spent so much time talking about the supply issues that Ukraine faces?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is an increasing amount of coverage for the Russian supply issues. I think part of it is just that it's a very sophisticated assessment and it has a lot of caveats. There's great open source analysts that are doing research that are imaging Russia's main storage areas where they have the boneyards from the Soviet era tanks and armored personnel carriers, and how over time, over the last 3 years, you can watch them slowly empty out. And all the current estimates of these open air storage areas indicates that at the current loss rates, the Russians are going to be running very low, if not be out of their Soviet era inherited equipment by late 2025, early 2026. That's not just my opinion. CSIS and RUSI and other organizations have made similar analyses as well. So this is sort of the analytical consensus at the time. Of course, there's the caveats. It assumes that the Russians don't magically get an offset from the Chinese or other partners who might be able to provide a lot of vehicles quickly. It assumes that the Russian defense industrial base isn't able to rapidly increase its current serial production of new vehicles. But there's no reason to necessarily assess that'll be the case given the limitations. But it's sort of like we all believe, or we all have this little idea that the Russian military is sort of like, it's the Red Army, and no matter how many tanks and armored personnel carriers you destroy, the Russians are constantly just going to come back with hordes and loads of more stuff. That's just a myth. Actually, Russia's resources are finite. They're burning through a tremendous amount. And I actually think that the intensified campaigns that we see the Russians conducting now are in large part in order to shape the information space and make us think that the Russian can sustain this current tempo indefinitely, when in fact they cannot. There's a whole very interesting conversation we could have about the Russian economy too, and their force generation problem. I mean, the Russian economy seems to be sort of imploding in real time as we talk now as well.
Well, let's just drill down into that briefly as well, because the Russian economy is kind of the key factor here. If Putin were going to be somehow persuaded to change tack when it comes to Ukraine, if he were persuaded to maybe cede some ground, if he were even to come under threat in terms of his personal position, what happens with the Russian economy is crucial. We saw earlier on this year how the ruble tanked following the incursion into Kursk. What is the current situation? What are the weaknesses currently with the Russian economy?
Sure. So today's November 25. As of I last checked yesterday, the Russian ruble is trading against the dollar. It's less than 1 penny. One US penny is equivalent to a ruble. Look, the Russians have massive macro and microeconomic issues right now. The Russian central bank has set an overnight low interest rate of 21%, which is extremely high. The Russian economy is overheating. The Russian Ministry of Defense has been giving out rubles for the one-time sign-on bonuses and all the economic incentives like candy to anyone who will go fight in Ukraine. So the Russian economy is flush with cash, and this is causing inflation to just go completely out of control. Meanwhile, there's a huge structural Russian labor deficit on the supply side. Look, Russians can fight in uniform in Ukraine as employees of the Ministry of Defense, or they can work in Russia's domestic civilian economy. But they can't do both. And we know that as of December 2023, the Russian economy was already facing a 5 million person labor shortage. The Russians cannot offset that. And in fact, because the Ministry of Defense has been putting forward such absurd and lucrative contracts to go fight in Ukraine, oftentimes the one-time bonus is exceeding what the average Russian annual salary is. That has forced the private firms to have to artificially inflate their salary compensation in order to maintain a modicum of competitiveness for an increasingly limited number of laborers. 30,000 Russians are killed in action or wounded per month. Um, that's going to just continue to degrade the number of Russians that can actually work or serve. And I really do think that when you look at the current hard status of the Russian economy, be it the inflation, the interest rates, the prices of commodities like butter is now a hot topic within Russia. It's becoming quite clear that the economic roosters are coming, or hens are coming back to roost. And it's also clear that, look, there was these Russian efforts to court the North Koreans to recruit many tens of thousands of North Koreans to go to fight in the war, the effort to get Yemeni men via the Houthis, the previous failed effort to recruit several thousand Indians, right? These are all the ways that the Kremlin is trying to stitch together at the seams its current effort and tempo, because if we keep the Russians on course for the current attritional war for another 18 months, this system is going to break.
You mentioned the Yemenis. I mean, this is a relatively recent development, it would seem. We know about the North Korean troops fighting on the side of Russia, but the fact that they're now going to Yemen, trying to recruit from the Houthi fighters there, I mean, how fraught with risk is that for Vladimir Putin, both in terms of the fact that it speaks to his underlying weakness when it comes to manpower, but also in terms of, you have an incoming Trump administration who some argue may be more sympathetic towards Vladimir Putin, but they would not necessarily be sympathetic to anyone who is buddying up with Iran, which Russia have been, and with the Houthis in Yemen. So does it speak to Putin's weakness, and what risks are there attached to that?
Sure. Well, it's to be determined exactly the scale and size of the recruitment. So the Financial Times just yesterday broke a story that the Houthis have been the fixers for the Kremlin, and they've been apparently involved in helping recruit several hundred Yemeni men. The FT report described the majority of them as not having previous fighting experience to go fight in Russia. And that's fine. The Russians have developed a concept of operations where they can take untrained personnel, like prisoners that were languishing in jail for a long time, or criminals or other people, and just send them to the front lines and mass meat assaults, and you can make some tactical gains that way. The current Russian warfare can use essentially, poorly trained, not very capable infantry to make some gains on the battlefield. I think it depends entirely on the scale and size of what they can get from the Yemenis, but it's not just the Yemenis. I would be inclined to look at all these alternative force generation pipelines as the system by which the Russians are trying to offset their current operational, monthly losses. So, for example, if between the North Koreans, the Yemenis, I believe we've got Cubans fighting in Russia for the Russians as well, right? All of these little things, a couple hundred here, a couple thousand there, those add up. And if, for example, the Russians can pull in 10,000 foreign fighters from a variety of different countries per month, then that basically offsets 1/3 of their monthly casualty rate, which is not a bad offset. So that's what that is about. Regarding the policy and the politics of it all, look, it's unfortunate that Iran and Iran's larger proxy network throughout the Middle East are becoming increasingly involved in the war in Ukraine, because they do grant the Russians important capabilities. Thankfully for people such as myself, they help us make the argument that you cannot be an Iran hawk and a Russia dove. These are incompatible positions. And in fact, when you see the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Iranians increasingly supporting and working with the Russians in exchange for other capabilities the Russians are giving these states, you now actually have to realize that this is actually resembling more of an axis of hostile authoritarian states. And in order to effectively deal with these adversaries, you actually have to treat them all as adversaries. And so, with the Iran's deepening engagement and now the Houthis becoming fixers for force generation, it helps us make the case that, look, if we're going to be serious about being tough on China and Iran, then you also have to be tough on Russia too. The Russian stated objective for their fall campaign cycle in 2024 was the seizure of Pokrovsk. They got Avdiivka back in April. Since then, they've been driving to Pokrovsk, and that was their explicit objective. The Russians, however, have since then hit very stiff resistance on the immediate outskirts of Pokrovsk. They managed to seize many of the fields and the villages. They advanced about 30 kilometers from Avdiivka up to the vicinity of Pokrovsk, but since then, they have not been able to advance. And starting in the fall, the Russian command actually stopped conducting these sort of headbutt frontal assaults directly into Pokrovsk, but then they started to attack the flanks south of Pokrovsk and expand their penetration, expand their salient. And what the Russian command was doing was they were finding opportunities by looking for these weak spots in the Ukrainian line. They exploited Ukrainian unit rotations, they found weak spots in the line, and they reinforced it. And the way I like to think about the Russian military here is they sort of think like water. Sort of like how water tries to find the path of least resistance when it's thrown on a bunch of rocks or something. When it hits a hard object, sometimes they just slog through. But in this case, they actually decided to not slog through, and they decided to find other paths through which they could develop some advances as well. And the Russians have advanced. They found some weak spots in the line, and they have seized more territory south of Pokrovsk. And we actually just last night on November 24th, published a new piece that forecasted what the Russians might be attempting to do in that territory south of Barros. I'm quite concerned about those Russian gains. But I think what's been lost in all of this is, yes, the Russians have seized these fields and this territory, and on the map it looks quite big, but none of this is strategic territory. And actually, the achievement of blunting a major Russian offensive and denying the Russians their preferred objective for this season is actually a success of defense. Yes, the Ukrainians have lost ground in other places, but for a prepared pitched battle where the Ukrainians could anticipate the main Russian effort and blunt it, that's good. Now let's talk a little bit about south of Pokrovsk, if I might. So the Russians seized Vuhledar, which is an operationally significant town, on October 1st, and the Russians have succeeded in leveraging their tactical gains in Vuhledar to be able to further advance in that sort of southeasternmost corner of the theater, if you're looking at the map. The Russians are currently advancing north of Vuhledar. They've created a pocket, a salient near a town called Kurakovo next to a large reservoir, and they're currently trying to collapse the flanks and envelop that pocket. And then the Russians are also trying to attack the easternmost flank of a town called Velika Novosilka, which is operationally significant, which is a Ukrainian strong point. These Russian gains are quite concerning because the Russians are actually now just under 10 kilometers from the border between Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast, and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And if the Russians wanted, if they're not able to get to Pokrovsk through the direct frontal assault, then what they might decide to do is attack the rear and envelop the Ukrainian positions and try to intersect the key highways that actually run to and support the Ukrainian positions near Pokrovsk. I know a lot of this sounds abstract, so you might maybe, the listeners could look at a map while I'm talking about this. And there are some weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the Ukrainian line the Russians are exploiting. And they're making some relatively rapid advances for this war, but in the grand scheme of what is normal in mechanized warfare, still quite slow and quite attritional. I'd also note that the Russians seem to be getting better at waging more complex operations. So what we see now operating in this sort of Pokrovsk, Kurakovo, Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka corner of the theater is we see elements of at least 3 different major Russian groups of forces from the Central Military District, the Southern Military District, and the Eastern Military District all operating here. That's a big deal. Historically, the Russians do not have, historically they've not been successful at having multiple elements of different large formations and groups of forces be able to work out the interoperability to effectively converge on a single area and conduct those combined operations before. What we're seeing now is a more complex cast of characters involved in the operation, Russian gains to boast for it, and if the Russians are successful in the coming months of continuing the momentum that they're building right now, then that would indicate that the Russian command is actually learning some lessons, becoming more effective, and restoring some of the principles of the great venerated Soviet doctrine and the operational art that the Russian Federation seemed to have forgotten and not successfully executed for all of this war. So a lot of eyes are happening right now and pointed at that southern part of Donetsk Oblast and trying to see, all right, the Russians were not prepared to have an opening here in the south. They were trying to go for Pokrovsk, but they now have found themselves with an opening here. They did not prepare for it necessarily. How far will they be able to take it? And that's the sort of the open research question that we have now. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
Russian forces are making the fastest advances since the early days of the 2022 invasion, according to analysts and war bloggers. How are they making those advances?
Okay, the Ukrainians are, I feel very strongly on this point actually. The Ukrainians are, the average age is about 43 of the combat troops, guys and girls in the front line. That's quite old. And these guys, and well, especially the guys, they don't look like 43-year-olds back home. They've had a tough post round in a lot of cases. They're not as fit or as healthy in some cases. Back in other Western countries, they're not as well equipped. They're not as well trained. They're not as well led in a lot of cases, and they're getting shot at. And, they've been doing this for coming up to 3 years in some cases. They're tired. So when the Russians are pushing, it's not because they're not making larger gains now because the Russians are doing something that's particularly effective. The Russians are pretty low standard across the board. So the reason the Ukrainians are falling back is because their flanking units are getting rolled up. So then obviously a unit if a flanking formation gets pushed back, then obviously you need to consider withdrawing. Otherwise, you could get outflanked by the enemy. So that's one reason why you see multiple units falling back when the Russians might only be advancing on an axis somewhere else. Also, I think a problem here, the fields you get down in the south, some of them are very, very large. It could be 1 kilometre or 1.5 kilometres long. So frontline battalion formations the troops will occupy the tree lines. There'll be trenches in the tree lines. They don't have positions in the middle of the fields, of course. So when they fall back, historically they've fallen back to the tree line behind them. Well, if a battalion, say, occupies a 3 kilometre deep position, that's a lot of tree lines. But behind the battalions that the Ukrainians have got here, there's not a great deal of defensive action going on, not a great deal of defensive engineering going on. So a lot of money and time has been put into building these defence lines all around the country, but they're way too far back. So they've been put in place out of drone and out of artillery range, which is way too far behind frontline battalions to be of use to them immediately. So what we're seeing is initially the Russians would push these troops back, and they'd fall back tree line to tree line, and they might make a few hundred meters in one day, or maybe 1 kilometer over a couple of days. But when they get to the end of that battalion and there's nothing behind, what's left of that frontline formation then has to fall all the way back to the next set of positions that have been prepared, maybe leaving some standing patrols and observation posts in between instead of lots and lots of prepared positions. What has been lacking here is support for frontline troops from an engineering perspective. There needs to be more digging going on here. There could be a lot more civilian contractors involved. Obviously, there's a threat from artillery and drones, so that's why a lot of stuff gets put in place too far back. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Russians are now advancing far more than they were beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. Throw into the whole of that mix the kind of ammunition problems that troops are having. What kind of problems are they having with quality? Because I've been hearing reports that they've had problems of things like mortars misfiring on the front line.
I think
is that widespread?
I'm sure the ammunition that's coming from the West is of a decent standard. It's when you have stuff that's been produced and stored or produced for and stored in countries that don't have the same sort of husbandry standards that we have, the same sort of storage standards that have to be adhered to. When you have mortar rounds so a mortar round has, it comes with, it's an actual bomblet, and then around the base of the bomblet you put these little plastic clips which are filled with a propellant charge, and you can add so many to make it go further, or you can, but if they haven't been stored properly, and a lot of Soviet-style Soviet boxes are made of wood and they're not wrapped properly, the actual ammunition, the propellant charges can become waterlogged, or even if there's a little bit of dampness in them, it will affect the way that the bomb comes out of the barrel. So I think that's something I've seen personally outside of Ukraine. And I think that's probably something that's happening in a lot of areas. But as far as the quality of Western supplied ammunition is concerned, I don't think Ukraine's got anything to worry about with that. I'm sure some people might contradict me on that. I know there are some dodgy stingers knocking around, batch one stingers that were given by Western European countries initially, but a lot of the stuff that's coming now is new.
Experts will be trying to find out as much as they can about the Orezhnik intermediate range ballistic missile.
Yep.
What can you tell us? What do you know?
Well, I don't know anything new, I'm sure. I mean, it's good to know that the hotline between Russia and America is still working. They call each other when there's a launch and when they're testing stuff, and apparently that was used. Initially, the chat was that it was an ICBM. I think that was mainly down to present company excluded media hysteria. First of all, people thought it was an RSO-26, which is a Ruzbek or something else, Ruzbek, which has 4 MIRVs. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targeted Re-entry Vehicle. Then later on, the news came out that it was an updated version of that on a Rezhnik, which has 6 MIRVs. And I think people really cottoned onto the fact that it was something different when footage started appearing online showing MIRVs entering through the cloud cover, and they slowed these down, and they basically looked exactly what most missile tests look like when those things are coming down. It's an area weapon when it's used like that. They didn't have any warheads loaded with anything. They were just empty MIRVs and or MIRVs, and so in that respect, it's just another case of the Russians using weapons to terrorize civilian population. These things went everywhere. Russian ICBMs or IRBMs in this case are not known for their accuracy. Same goes for Chinese stuff. That's why they've historically always had much larger warheads. Whereas the stuff that America's produced, and obviously France to a lesser extent, they're far more accurate and they don't need such large warheads. But this thing came down and sprayed its MIRVs all over the place and wasn't good.
And as you say, sent without explosives and at such a high cost. And you say the point is to spread terror, but it's a very expensive way to do it for comparatively little damage.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a figure $50 million was the cost. I mean, that's how much the equivalent might have cost. I would imagine the equivalent back in America would cost a lot more than that. But it doesn't cost that much to make these sort of things in Russia, I imagine. But as far as value for money is concerned, the effect it had on the West, as I said, media hysteria, and the effect that it had on general populations around the world, it was probably a good call. Well, not a good call, but you got a lot of bang for his buck, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, and he's certainly, President Putin, capitalising on it now, because he's now saying he has a handful ready for combat and they'll use them again. He also claims that these missiles cannot be intercepted. Is that right?
Well, I think they probably can if you got THAAD, which stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Air Defense, I think, which is a it's a 6-pack missile on a mobile launcher. So it looks not dissimilar to a Patriot, but obviously larger, and there's six tubes on the back of each launcher. These things are very expensive. I'd be very surprised if America positioned any of those in Ukraine. Although there is talk of them having done that in Israel, so if they're going to do that for there, then they might want to do it here. But a lot of things happen for other countries that don't happen for Ukraine, sadly, because of the red lines that everybody's scared about. Short answer, yes, they can be intercepted at various stages of their trajectory.
And what about Ukraine? Does it have air systems it can develop to help itself?
What you need is a THAAD to knock one of these things down. So Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. It's a bit like a Patriot, but it's much more capable. You get, I say it's a bit like a Patriot. It comes off, it has a similar looking launcher, but you have 6 missiles on the back of a transporter instead of 4. These things can knock down, MIRVs at a fairly high altitude. There's also a ship and shore-based system that America's been using for a while. So it's called Aegis Ashore. Aegis is the code name for the actual radar system. But they have missiles that are co-located with those radar systems. I think in Poland, I think maybe in Romania as well. But don't quote me on that last bit. And a lot of their ships have them. Obviously, that's not something that can be transported from an existing land-based system in an Eastern European country, or a ship that's not in the Black Sea. So really, the only thing that could bring something like this down is a THAAD. I'm not sure if America would position those here, because it would require the use of American troops to operate them. And they're reticent about having boots on the ground openly.
Intermediate range ballistic missiles are typically meant for long range nuclear strikes thousands of kilometres away, and this one flew just 700 kilometres. If it is intended as a warning to the West in the light of attacks by Storm Shadows and ATACMS into Russia, and as you said, there was media hysteria about it, how do you think it should be regarded by Ukraine's allies and their leaders?
Well, again, I don't want to sound glib about things like this, but the number of lines that have been drawn in the sand by the little man in Moscow is just ridiculous. And a lot of the things that he's been saying recently are he's just regurgitating what's happened, what he said before. So this new set of doctrine or this new policy that they've been talking about, it's just things that have been said over the past couple of years, in fact, in some cases. But so I don't think it's something that people should lose much sleep about. As I said, one should never talk of nuclear weapons lightly, or any kind of weapon. But I'm sure there's a lot of people in the West that will be getting their knickers in a twist about this, when actually they should just be ramping up the support for Ukraine.
And according to TASS, the Russian state news agency, Russia's still planning to use Sarmat, its intercontinental ballistic missile, on combat duty. But one exploded on the test launch site in Russia in September. I mean, it's beset with problems. So that threat right now, it's empty, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it. Well, I think it probably is quite empty because, I mean, do they actually work? I mean, all the tests seem to be going wrong. I'm sure they'll get them figured out at some point, but I think it's just another example of Putin rattling things over in the Kremlin and waiting for people to react in the West, as they do.
What do you consider to be the most important developments to watch in the conflict right now?
Recruitment, I think, probably. It's an ongoing problem. The Ukrainians have got a finite resource in that respect. There's a lot of Ukrainians abroad that could come back and fight for their country if they felt like it. There's a lot of people here that I think could step up to the plate. There's definitely a feeling in some parts of and many towns that the war is something that other people do. There's a lot of people who give very valuable service in humanitarian organisations. There's a lot of people who make drones and are involved in the defence industry, all of which have a great impact and help out. But I think a lot of people here could maybe look at themselves in the mirror and reassess their current role, and think maybe they should be in uniform.
And on the subject of manpower, Ukraine is considering building 14 new brigades with recruits. Yep. Is that the right thing to do, or would it be better to replenish the existing ones?
Well, it's not for me to tell the Ukrainians how to do things, although I have a lot of opinions, as you know. I think forming new brigades is there are plus points and negative points to things like this. If we look at how some of the unblooded, for want of a better phrase, divisions that came ashore on D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, how some of the divisions that hadn't seen any combat before, especially on the American side. I think there's a strong argument to say that what you could do is beef up the brigades you've got currently. So send a lot of battle casualty replacements, as many as you can, to get those brigades up to strength, and then maybe split them in half. Just like cells splitting. Create a twin of something good that's already out there that's got combat experience, and then dilute the new brigade, or dilute both brigades with new recruits. But forming brand new brigades, I think probably comes with more negative points.
In terms of the British support for Ukrainian forces and their manpower problems, what more could be done?
Training in country, I think, is the way forward. It costs a lot and takes a long time to take Ukrainians out of Ukraine back to the UK and other countries in Europe. I think a lot of that time and expense could be spent on doing things in country. Obviously, there's all sorts of things to consider there. I think it's a natural progression, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later. More training in country with a lot more ammunition and equipment given to training units in Ukraine is vital.
Particularly now we have Donald Trump re-elected as US president. Do you think that will mean he will push for a kind of negotiated settlement in his first few weeks in office? There has been talk of maybe a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know how you feel about that, or even some kind of freezing of the front lines. How would you feel about that?
I think that Donald Trump will obviously try to stop the conflict as soon as possible, according to his opinion, according to his thoughts, observations that he has. But it will not really be possible. First of all, the demilitarized zone must be patrolled by the UN peacekeepers. And this is completely impossible because otherwise they would be there already back in 2022. Unfortunately, Russia is a permanent member of UNSC. That is why we will never see that happening. Russians don't want peacekeepers in Ukraine. They don't want this conflict to stop. They didn't start the war to stop the war. It's crazy. They didn't start the invasion in Ukraine because they wanted peace. If you want peace, you don't go to a different country killing people. That is not how peace works. Unfortunately, a lot of people were brainwashed into believing, the opposite. Another thing is Trump will definitely understand, he will come to this understanding that agreements with Putin cannot be reached, or they will not be respected by Putin, because Putin already violated plenty of treaties. He violated Budapest Memorandum. He violated the territorial agreement signed by Putin himself with Ukrainian President Kuchma in 2003, recognizing Crimea and Donbass and all the borders of Ukraine as Ukrainian territory. And he mentioned this himself several times in 2007, back in those days. And of course, he violated that. Minsk agreements that were also violated numerous times, even though there is such misunderstanding among people who believe that it's Ukraine, the one that violated Minsk agreements. At the same time, Debaltseve that Russians captured back in 2014 in winter. According to Minsk agreement, it was supposed to be returned under Ukrainian control, which never happened. According to Minsk agreements, Russians were not supposed to build new positions like they did during our deployment, for example, in Zaitsev, in Travneva, on the Svitlodarsk Bulge, where they would dig closer and closer and trying to capture our positions and shelling us every day. And I lost my friends from my brigade due to the Russian fire that was not supposed to happen due to the Minsk, according to the Minsk agreements. But I lost friends, by the way, during the days when Trump was president. So one thing that I'm sure will happen is that eventually he will understand that it's impossible to have any agreements with Putin because he doesn't respect that. He has his own global strategy that he will try to, the objectives that he will try to achieve no matter what. And eventually, I think Trump and his administration will come to understanding that they have to arm Ukraine with everything we need. And most probably that is something that will happen. I'm not really sure how it correlates with the idea of American isolationism, because if you want to preserve peace in some area, you have to have your country, your military power represented there somehow. If there's nobody there, then you don't have any influence in that region anyways. So I believe that it will end with Donald Trump supporting Ukraine anyways. On the other hand, though, of course, other situation may happen, and his administration can decide that probably it's not worth it because Ukraine is far away on the other part of the globe, and we can just withdraw all the support and everything else. But in this case, we still have Europe. We have European allies. Currently, it was mentioned that daily support for Ukraine cost a European 1.5 cups of coffee. Literally, after the war is finished, I will just, I will give out coffee to all the guests coming to Ukraine personally. I don't care. But people must also remember that European Union, members of NATO within Europe, make roughly 50% of the whole annual GDP of NATO countries. That is approximately $40 trillion a year, and roughly half of that is the contribution of European NATO members. Therefore, if it's 3 cups of coffee a day instead of 1.5, does it make big difference? Because unlike in Russia, Europeans can afford that. Unlike in Russia, Europeans have future and good good environment, good roads, good everything, comparing to what we see in terrorist federation when 2/3 of population don't have in-house toilets. On the other hand, we can see that North Korea, for example, is expanding its military production. There was information, I think it emerged only yesterday, that North Koreans escalate the production of long-range missiles for Russians. And again, people must ask themselves, why does Russia buy weaponry in North Korea, in Iran? Aren't they able to produce it themselves? And that is a good question, because people who believe that Russia is almighty, that it's like it has indestructible military and things like that, they must ask themselves, if it is so, then why Russia so badly needs help from such countries as Iran and North Korea, Syria, Yemen, African countries, Colombia, Venezuela, to destroy this weak, losing Ukraine? That is a good question that I hope that everybody will ask themselves.
Well, that's a very good point. And I wanted to ask you actually about some of the logistical and supply problems that Russia have at the moment, because yes, it is true that Russia is worryingly making some gains still, particularly at the moment in the west of Donetsk Oblast. But if you kind of scratch beneath the surface, we know they've got serious manpower problems. We've talked about the casualty rate for some time, and that's why they're taking soldiers from the Houthis and from North Korea and from other places. But also from an equipment point of view, I mean, according to the Institute for the Study of War, in their most recent update, Russian command posts are now relying on Chinese-made radios for internal communications, because Russia cannot domestically produce enough quality radios for the Russian military. So I suppose there is this kind of sense at the moment that just as the talk about some negotiated settlement is kind of amping up, there is actually a fundamental weakness being exposed in Russia, which, if you're a Ukraine supporter who wants to see Putin thoroughly defeated, must be frustrating, because you think, look, if we can stick this out, Russia can't last that much longer.
Absolutely. And I believe that one of the best ways to destroy the Russian threat, the threat of Russian terrorism, it's not through military, it's through economics. Because if the world manages to choke Russia economically and isolate it and literally cancel it on the international market, then Russia is absolutely powerless and useless. They will not be able to continue their aggression, and we will forget about this threat, at least for a while. Regarding radios, by the way, this is true, and this is something that we noticed even back in the days in 2022. They already had the problem that they lacked radio stations for their personnel. They used those Chinese Baofeng radio stations that we used in 2017 to scan and intercept their communications between the hybrid terrorist groups. So that is exactly the case. In our case, it's of course different. My brigade, for example, was equipped with Harris stations like back in 2017. And they were extremely, extremely advanced comparing to other stations like Motorola's, for example. We already had that back then, and we were trying to use that equipment. It's extremely good comparing to what Russians have. It's extremely good. But, if you really want to understand if Russia has problems with their equipment, you gotta check out those videos where Russians ride like golf carts and motorcycles into the battle. The recent video I saw, and it literally cracked me up so bad, was when Russians drove like Zhiguli, like this old Lada machine, into attack. And then this Lada had to return really fast because the attack failed, obviously. But another thing, like the other side of this is that Ukraine has a lot of support that is basically proved by the fact that we have all kinds of cars. We have hundreds of trucks delivered to Ukrainians by different volunteers, Car for Ukraine, NAFO, and other extremely decent people. And looking at what happens in Ukraine, anybody can understand that this war is extremely black and white. It's extremely clear. You can extremely clearly see what side is basically terrorists, despised by the rest of the world, and which side is supported by the rest of the world. By the developed countries, you can see that Ukrainians have plenty of support, not just from governments, from approximately 50 countries that support Ukraine in terms of military, in terms of military supplies, but also by people from all around the world, not only Europe, not only United States, but also South Korea, also Japan, Thailand, and other countries, Australia, of course, New Zealand. You can see that this war is something very, very clear. And of course, it takes Russians a lot of resources to brainwash people and convince them that, no, in fact, Russia was, just defending itself. That's why they invaded Ukraine.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.